Can I ask you a question, Matthew? Madge squinted at me through muddy brown eyes. She was sitting in her usual armchair by the window, wrinkled hands folded in her lap. She'd gotten my name wrong, again. But I didn't bother correcting her. Over the weeks I've been visiting her, I've had Matthew, Tim, Fred, Bill, Bob, and Henry. It'll be enough for a football team soon. I'm used to it by now. Ignoring mistakes like that's one of the first things the nurse taught me. Said it only confuses them if you keep picking up on little things. Of course, Madge, I said, smiling at her now. What did you want to ask me? If you were old, she said slowly, old like me, what would you want to do? What would I want to do about what? At the end, love. Would you want one last big blowout? Or would you just fade away in peace? I stared at Madge, trying to hide my confusion. I had the urge to glance around the nursing home for help, but I resisted. I don't know much about the old lady, but I do know this. She has dementia. Has it bad, apparently. That was the first thing they told me when I started volunteering. They warned me she'd likely say a lot of things that confused me. Things that didn't make any sense. And they were right about that. I've got used to it by now, but Madge's question caught me off guard. I think it was because it was the first time I'd heard her sound close to normal. The ghost of the person she once was. She'd asked me something. I'd responded. And then she'd followed up with another question. Usually all I get from her is comments about the weather, and random stories I assume are from her past. Nothing like this. I opened my mouth to say something back to Madge. Then I paused, made myself stop and think. Usually I had no problem making small talk with her, but now I felt a wave of self-doubt drifting through my head. The truth is, I'm no expert when it comes to the elderly, especially not elderly people with dementia. A long way from it. And despite the cheerful image I try to give off to the residents who live at Eldridge Nursing Home, I'm not actually here out of the goodness of my heart, either. I should come clean. The truth is, helping out the home is killing two birds with one stone for me. The volunteering counts towards my Duke of Edinburgh award, which will apparently help me when I come to apply for uni next year. That's one thing. The other is way more interesting, though, and that's the fact that Eldridge Nursing Home is haunted. Or at least it's meant to be haunted. That's what the rumors say. The place is practically legendary in our town. Ever since I was a little kid, I've heard stories about it. Some say there are ghosts living in the attic and that come down and possess the residents at night. Others say the building is haunted by a witch called Old Wendy. I've even heard one story, my personal favorite, that claims a secret child murdering cult is based there. A shadowy organization that makes kids disappear. The stories are all ridiculous, of course. I know that. I'm not completely gullible, but I will admit, I've always had weird fascination with ghosts and urban legends. I've always been drawn to them. So when I learned that one of my modules this year will be on local history, I thought Eldridge Nursing Home would be the perfect case to study. The only problem? The image I had in my head hasn't quite lived up to the reality. Sure, Eldridge looks eerie enough on the outside. It's this huge, towering brick building on the edge of town that could be straight out of a horror film. But as I discovered on my first day, the inside is actually quite dull. It's clean and modern, and there are staff in bluey-gray uniforms flitting about all over the place. It's more like a hospital than a haunted house. And instead of exploring dimly lit corridors and interviewing creepy old blokes about their encounters with the paranormal, I've been stuck sitting with Madge. 90% of the time, she's silent, and the other 10% of the time, she spouts some gibberish. Only now, she wasn't speaking gibberish. Would you want one last blowout, or would you just fade away in peace? I ran the question through my mind again. Where the hell did that come from? Sure, Madge had asked the occasional questions before, but it was usually just stuff about my day, or whether I'd put the kettle on. Questions she'd often repeat several times over the course of the hour I sat with her. She'd never asked me anything like this before. I suddenly became aware that Madge was still looking at me, watching me through her muddy eyes. Those eyes normally twitched back and forth in their sockets, as though they were looking for something she could never quite find. So having them fixed on my face was a little unsettling. Then I realized she was probably waiting for me to respond to what she had said. I'd spent the last 30 seconds daydreaming, and I'd completely forgotten to answer her. Would I want to have a big blowout? That's right, love. Would you want one last time, or would you prefer to go out peaceful? I shuffled in my seat and frowned. I still didn't really know what Madge was on about, but I figured I'd take some advice that some nurse called Brenda had given me on my first day. Sometimes it's just better to play along. Well, I suppose that depends, Madge, I said now. It depends on what's going to make you happy. I don't really know where those words came from, but they sounded right as I said them, and Madge seemed pleased with my answer. She actually nodded her head, still fixing me with those brown eyes. Then her smile faded. Can I ask you one more question, Sam? I felt a tiny chill go through me. Sam. She'd gotten my name right. For the very first time in 2 months I'd been visiting her, she actually said my name. I nodded my head. Sure, Madge. What would you like to ask me? She leaned forward slightly in her chair, kept her eyes locked on mine. After a moment, her thin lips parted to reveal a mouthful of chipped brown teeth. Are you a good boy, Sam? She spoke the words softly, her eyes never leaving my face. Have you been a good young man? I felt another faint chill go down my back. Madge's lips were still parted, and I had to force myself not to stare at her teeth. I had to resist the urge to look at my watch on my wrist too, to see if my hour was up. Despite her best intentions, Madge could be a little creepy sometimes, but she was also ill, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I forced myself to meet her gaze and nodded my head, fixed a smile on my face. I certainly am, Madge, or at least I try my best. Madge leaned back in her chair, and her smile widened. I thought so. A second later, something in her eyes, a hint of intensity that had not been there a moment before. A hint of the intensity that had been there a moment before faded. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes shifted in their sockets, suddenly looking over my shoulder. I took the opportunity to check the watch on my wrist. I had gone 5 minutes over. Time to go. Well, Madge, I said, standing up and slinging my rucksack on my shoulder. It's been lovely chatting with you, but I have to head off now. I'll see you again next week, though. Madge only continued staring past me, off into the corner of the nursing home. I put my other arm through the rucksack and turned to leave. But just as I was starting away from Madge's corner of the nursing home lounge, her voice stopped me. I've got something for you, you know. I paused and turned back. Madge was still staring off into the far corner of the room, not looking at me. But now her hands were moving in her lap. As I watched, her gnarled fingers slowly unclenched from one another. I heard the soft rustle of paper. Madge's eyes rolled in her sockets, finding my own. She smiled again. Didn't you ever used to pass notes at school? I held the piece of paper in my hand before bed that night. It was a yellow post-it, folded into a tiny square. Madge had told me not to open it until I was going to sleep, had made me promise. And for some reason, I'd agreed. God knows why. It was probably nothing more than a message to her late husband, or a list of shopping she'd never have the chance to go out and buy. I should have unfolded the thing the minute I was outside Eldridge, then tossed it in the nearest bin. But for some reason, I didn't. And now, as I held it in my hand beneath the glow of my ceiling light, I thought back to what Madge had said to me earlier. Would you want one last time? Or would you want it to be peaceful? What had she meant by that? For some reason, the words unsettled me a bit. It was almost as if, for a fleeting moment, Madge had known she was old, and had known that she was ill, had known that maybe, in the not-too-distant future, her days of sitting and talking nonsense with me would be over. But I told myself that couldn't be right. Madge's mind wasn't right. Her question had probably been completely unconnected to the present. It was most likely a snapshot of some other conversation from some other time. As these thoughts went through my head, I opened the post-it note, and I felt myself go cold. There were only 6 words written on that little yellow piece of paper. 6 short words, scrawled in Madge's untidy handwriting. But as I read them, I felt a sick feeling creeping into my stomach like poison. I got back to the nursing home at 8 a.m. the next day, left before my parents were up, and cycled there fast, the wind whipping my face as I hammered the pedals. When I finally crunched into Eldridge's gravel driveway 20 minutes later, I was so out of breath I didn't even notice the ambulance and police cars parked near the entrance. Not at first. I noticed the officer standing in the reception area, though. Pam, the woman who sits behind the counter, was so busy speaking with him, she didn't even give me a second glance as I rushed by. There were more police in the main hallway, leading to the lounge area too. I noticed a pair of officers speaking with a balding man in a white coat, who I recognized as one of the home's doctors. Their expressions were serious, and they spoke in low voices. I hurried by. As I entered the lounge area I'd been sitting in the day before, my heartbeat was fast and hard in my chest. My stomach felt heavy with dread. There were only a few residents in the lounge. A couple of gray-haired women stood by the window in the corner, whispering to each other. A large, old man sat in a chair nearby on my left, balancing a coffee cup in one trembling hand. I scoured the room for Madge, but couldn't see her anywhere. Her usual chair was empty. I had no plan in my mind at that point. I just knew I needed to speak with her, needed to ask her about the note. I was about to turn and leave the room when I saw Brenda, the nurse who'd given me advice on my first day. She was standing by a food cart at the far end of the lounge, loading it with dirty mugs and plates. Her face was blank as she worked. I wandered over to her and stood by the cart, waiting for her to notice me. She almost jumped when she finally looked up. Her eyes widened briefly, and then a frown creased her forehead. "Sam? Weren't you in yesterday? I thought you came once, Brenda, do you know where Madge is? I have to speak with her." My words came out in a rushed jumble. I felt cold air blowing on my face from the air conditioning unit overhead. I felt cold in my skin, and I realized I must be sweating. Brenda's frown increased as she stared at me, and then, all of a sudden, it melted away. I saw something else pass behind her eyes, and suddenly realized how pale she looked. She still had a white china mug clenched in one hand, and as she lowered it to the food cart, I saw she was trembling slightly. Her eyes left my face and scanned the lounge around me, as if looking for help. "Oh, Sam, Didn't you hear?" "No, of course you wouldn't have. You only just got in. She trailed off and ran a hand through her graying black hair. Brenda is middle-aged and overweight, and right then I thought she looked almost like a frightened animal, like a badger caught in the headlights. I opened my mouth to respond, but she spoke before I could. The words tumbled out of her mouth in a rush. "It only happened last night, Sam. We didn't find out until this morning. I don't know why Pam at reception didn't tell you when you came in. She kept talking, but I could no longer hear what she was saying. My own heartbeat was ringing in my ears. I was picturing Madge, sitting in her chair with her hands clasped in her lap. Madge, asking me if I'd want one last blowout or something peaceful. Madge, pushing me a crumpled post-it note into my hand. I turned away from Brenda without saying anything, began walking back across the room. I was faintly aware that she was calling my name, but I didn't turn back. I just kept walking until I was back through the lounge doors, back into the corridor beyond. The door swung shut behind me, and I leaned against the wall, pulling in deep breaths, waiting for my heartbeat to slow in my chest. After a moment, I shut my eyes and concentrated hard on the rhythm of breathing, like Mom tells me to do when I'm anxious. In for 3, out for 5, over and over. When I next opened my eyes, I found an old man staring at me. He was stood on the opposite side of the corridor, his back to the wall. I recognized him as the same guy I'd seen in my way to the lounge, drinking coffee in the armchair. He wore a dark blue dressing gown that was hanging open to reveal a stained gray t-shirt and checkered pajama bottoms. The skin of his face was loose and flabby, drooping towards his neck like melted candle wax. His nose was large and curved. I could see a network of little red and purple veins in his cheeks, spreading out below tiny blue eyes that were buried in folds of flesh, eyes that were fixed on mine. "You missed all the excitement," the man spoke in a thick, Dorset accent. "You came out here." I stared back at him, unable to find words. He grinned at me. "Went away in the night, she did," he said. "They went into her room this morning and poof, gone. Just like that. Think we don't know what goes on around here, but we do. We talk." He let out a low chuckle and sputtered out into a cough. The sound made my skin crawl. When the man looked back up at me, his blue eyes were watering. "Want to know a secret?" He lowered his voice, glancing up and down the corridor. "When they got in there, all they found on her bed was teeth, like she'd melted into the bloody mattress." I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. The old man began chuckling again, and I took a breath, waiting for him to finish. "Madge?" I asked after his laughter had died out. "Do you mean Madge? Did something happen to her last night?" The old man frowned at me for a second, then broke into a grin. His teeth were even worse than Madge's had been, a dull brown, the color of coke. "Oh, something happened to her all right," he whispered. "Only we don't call her Madge around here." "What's that?" "Madge, you said her name was. Only, round here, we call her by her middle name, Wendy." The man let out another throaty chuckle. "Oh, yes. She was always old Wendy to us." I turned and walked away from him on legs that no longer felt like my own. His laughter followed me down the corridor. Once I was back outside Eldridge, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the post-it note Madge had given to me. I think I was hoping the message would be different, but the words were still the same. "I killed and ate 13 children." I crumpled the note into a ball and closed my eyes.